Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I will say that this is going to be a completely different video than what we had yesterday. Yesterday was an entire video of me telling you, you know what? Running back production doesn't matter. The combine is almost everything for these running backs, combined, of course, with draft capital and their ability to catch the ball in college. But regardless, their 40-yard dash time, their size actually strongly correlated to fantasy football success at the next level. Where at the wide receiver position, this may not necessarily be the case. And I want to go through and make the argument on why you are going to overreact at the wide receiver position when it comes to the NFL Combine. There are a few examples of what actually matters here. And of course, we will be diving into a little brief preview of what we should be expecting from these guys. But before we get into anything, make sure you're going down there, dropping a like in this video, subscribe to the channel if you play Dynasty Fantasy Football, and if you want to join a fantasy football group chat with us, of course, you can find the link to our Discord in the comment section and in the description. I believe we have over 10,000 people in that fantasy football group chat. Of course, I'm in there, and you can find the link completely free. But I think that should be about it. Let's go through and let's dive into what matters at the wide receiver position. And the first thing that I want to be looking at will be the 40-yard dash time, because this will be the main thing that people talk about. They do it every single season. And like I said at the very top, it actually does matter for running back. And at wide receiver, it will correlate to NFL draft capital. But this is something I've talked about way too much. I'm sure you're tired of hearing me talk about it by now. But what we actually find are the running backs that are the fastest at the NFL Combine always are overdrafted in the NFL draft, overdrafted in Dynasty, because their speed and their skill set will translate to something else at the NFL level that is not fantasy points. If we're going through and looking at speedy wide receivers from 2014 on, you have John Ross running a 4.22. You have Henry Ruggs 4.27, Hamler 4.27, Philip Dorsett 4.28, Curtis Samuel 4.31. As of recently, you have some speedsters like in last year's draft, Tyquan Thornton. The year before that, Tutu Atwell, Dwayne Eskridge. And what do all these guys have in common? All these guys get the NFL draft capital. Even the recent seasons, like we said, Tutu Atwell, Dwayne Eskridge, both go in the second round of the draft in 2021. And then this past year, you had Tyquan Thornton going in the second draft of the 2022 NFL draft. And these speedsters may actually be decent NFL players because they will stretch NFL defenses and allow other players underneath to see volume. Whereas we see the opposite end of the spectrum where you have slower wide receivers at the NFL draft that will naturally fall down draft boards. But if they find success at the next level, it will be almost exclusively because they turned into volume hogs. The perfect example of this would be going back to, say, 2013 Keenan Allen, would be going back to, say, 2021 Amon-Ra St. Brown. Some wide receivers that got knocked in the pre-draft process due to a lack of athleticism, and maybe that limits their overall value that they could provide for an NFL team, because it doesn't matter how many fantasy points Keenan Allen scores, he's never going to have the same upside from an NFL success perspective as someone like a Tyreek Hill that can actually go out there and be that explosive option over the top. And if we're going to be looking at the gray area, not even the boundaries between these wide receivers, it really doesn't matter if you run a 4.53 or if you run a 4.43, 4.38 at the wide receiver position. It's about all the same, if we're going to be completely honest with each other. So the only thing that I really even look at with the NFL Combine when it comes to these wide receivers is if they are incredibly fast. If they are John Ross, Dwayne Eskridge, Tutu Atwell, Tyquan Thornton, Henry Ruggs, I actually devalue them in fantasy football, because in our model, they're probably going to get bonus points for going so high in the NFL draft where that won't translate as a slot wide receiver would. And if we're going to be looking at wide receivers that are way too slow, wide receivers running a 4.65, I mean, you're closing in on the 4.7 range. Yes, we will knock them as well, because you don't want your wide receiver to have no athleticism. We just want him to be a respectable athlete, and you don't want him to be on either end of the extreme. So he can't be David Bell, but at the same time, you don't really want to be chasing Tyquan Thornton. You want something in the middle, which I mean, it's weird to say. Obviously, it's not black and white, but I mean, if you look at the historical data and you just think about it, it kind of makes sense. But some categories that actually matter for rookie wide receivers are going to be the production categories. And if we go production category by production category, the first thing that I want to be looking at is the percentage of the receiving yards on a per game basis that the wide receiver accounted for in their best collegiate season. If we're going to go through and look at the same way that we broke down the running back data set in yesterday's video, we are going to take all wide receivers that were drafted in dynasty leagues from 2014 to 2021. This is according to DLF ADP. We're going to get all those rookie wide receivers, and then we are going to be comparing that data set to the wide receivers that actually had success. Those are going to be the wide receivers that 2 years after they were drafted in dynasty leagues were still top 100 picks in dynasty startup drafts according to DLF ADP. So if we're going to go through and look at this right now, you are going to see that the spread of guys is very wide in terms of just overall wide receivers that were drafted. You have a lot of guys that the percentage of their team's passing yards were down there under 20%, under 25%, under 30%. And you have some players on the other end of the spectrum. You have someone getting up to like a 60%. I don't know exactly where Jalen Darden went a few years ago, but remember, that's a wide receiver coming from a school like North Texas where you're able to dominate, or it really doesn't matter how damn good you are there. If you have no competition alongside you, this isn't going to be as predictive. But if we're looking at that sweet zone, you're actually going to be looking at 28% for a minimum threshold for wide receivers. We only had about 5 wide receivers during this time period actually finding some level of success at the NFL level while not hitting a 28% mark in terms of their collegiate receiving yards on a per game basis for their overall offense in their best season. Now, of course, we're going to be adjusting this mark as well, and you're going to give significantly more credit for a wide receiver that played alongside top-tier talent. You're going to give significantly more credit for someone who played alongside Justin Jefferson like Jamar Chase, or going back to that same LSU team with maybe an Odell Beckham Jr. and a Jarvis Landry, going to Ole Miss and looking at DK Metcalf, AJ Brown, looking at Ohio State and seeing that you have Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, Jackson Smith, and Jigba. You're going to give those players naturally more credit, and we are going to manually adjust that compared to the guys that were at small schools. But this is going to be a very, very sticky statistic, as you see. And if we're going to go over to our next category, it's going to be the age that these players declared for the NFL draft. Now, I know a lot of people want to just look at the age. I personally prefer to just see how long they stayed in college. If they declared early, so they declared after their 3rd season in college, regardless of if that was a redshirt sophomore year or just a traditional true junior season, you have 106 players that declared early. And you had 106 players that stayed 4 or more years in college that were drafted in this data set. Where if we're going to be looking at players that actually had value 2 years down the road, 59% of that data set were the wide receivers that declared early, where about 40% of them were the wide receivers that stayed for that 4th season. So we start to see that that's another little data point that is valuable and correlates to fantasy success at the next level. Now, if we're going to be going through and looking at our next category, we can just look at overall NFL draft capital. Now, these charts are going to look a little weird because it's the same distribution, but look at the vertical column, look at the y-axis for the labels here. That is going to be incredibly important because if we are going through and looking at all the wide receivers that maintained value after their first 2 seasons, almost all of them were drafted before pick 100. Now, there were some wide receivers drafted after pick 100 that end up breaking out in year 3 and year 4. I'm not drafting a rookie wide receiver to try to get a year 4 breakout. I think you want that breakout at least after their sophomore season. So in my mind, this is very compelling evidence to say you want your wide receiver going inside the top 100 picks. Very rarely are you going to be able to find a wide receiver with success in day 3. But if we're going to be looking at these categories, there are 1 or 2 other ones that are incredibly important, and we're going to be going through this offseason and talking about the importance and statistical predictability of those categories. But we had the entire offseason to do this. Let's give a quick little preview on what we're going to be expecting with these wide receivers. I will say right now, Jackson Smith-Njigba will be slow. Okay, let's get it out there. He is going to be slow. He is my wide receiver 1. When he comes in and when he is slower than Jordan Addison, when he is slower than Zay Flowers, when he is possibly slower than Quentin Johnston, will I be moving him down from our wide receiver 1 overall? No, I will not. The only way we are moving down Jackson Smith-Njigba, if we see him come in slower than a 4.6, if he is in that David Bell range, then yes, I will begin to panic, and yes, he will drop. But prepare yourself going to the NFL draft that he is going to be slow. I don't need him stretching NFL defenses. I need him operating underneath, commanding volume, scoring fantasy points. I'm trying to find Amon-Ra St. Brown here. I'm not trying to find Jameson Williams. Now, our next wide receiver, Quentin Johnston, don't really think it matters. I could see him getting some hype given the fact that when we get the official size numbers for these players, yes, people are going to go, oh my God, he's a monster. In reality, think about the new age wide receivers that find success at the NFL level, at least from a fantasy football perspective. How many of those big-bodied guys are winning because of their frame? Really, the best big-bodied guy we've had in God knows how long is Mike Evans. That's pretty much it. So don't overreact due to Johnston's size. Doesn't really matter. Going over to Jordan Addison, Addison's just going to be good all around. No concerns with Jordan Addison. Should run a respectable time, should have a respectable size. I think that Addison's a very safe player to be betting on. I don't necessarily know if he has the same fantasy football upside as a Jackson Smith-Njigba, but very, very safe. And I don't think anybody's going to have any hesitations with what they see at the combine. Josh Downs is another player that I can potentially be worried about. Because if we are going to go through and look at our model, it loves Josh Downs. I mean, Josh Downs, his sophomore season, 40% team market share. This is more than Jordan Addison, who was at 33%. This is more than Quentin Johnston, who is at 33%. This is more than Jackson Smith-Njigba, who's at 32%. Now, with Josh Downs, I do not expect him to go anywhere close to the same range as those other players. He was at a smaller school, and to go along with this, he is going to be slow. He is another player that's similar to Jackson Smith-Njigba. I believe he will be a better fantasy football option than he will be a real-life option. Never are you going to be seeing Josh Downs go behind the safety, stretch NFL defense. He's not going to be that big play guy. He's going to be the volume guy underneath. Zay Flowers will be someone that goes. He's the only 4-year player at the very top of this draft of the wide receiver position that I think people are excited about. I mean, you have pretty much every other 4-year wide receiver with hesitations. We need to at least give Flowers a little credit. The man did break out in year 2. Not only did he break out in year 2, but he continued to get better every single season from a market share perspective, where his senior year, he was at 36%. I think he is going to be a good athlete. Not worried about that whatsoever. Yeah, I don't think Zay Flowers is going to be the story of this combine. Now, going over to Jalen Hyatt, this will be a very interesting player to talk about. Because if we are going to be looking at Hyatt, this is a wide receiver that in 12 games played, had almost 1,300 receiving yards, had 15 receiving touchdowns. I mean, he was dominant from a production standpoint. And he was a junior. He declares early. Plus, he will get NFL draft capital. So he checks a lot of boxes. I mean, he does look like an exciting player, but at the same time, I personally have him pretty low in our rankings. And it goes right back to what we were discussing at the very beginning of this video, where you're looking at wide receivers that primarily get hype based off their speed, primarily get hype based off their 40-yard dash time. And while they could very easily turn into good players at the NFL level, they may not at the same time be good fantasy football options. But like I said, I want to give Hyatt his credits. The man, I mean, let's pull up his exact market share numbers here. His junior season was at about 33% of his team's receiving yards on a per game basis. So, I mean, at the end of the day, that's about the same as Quentin Johnston, his sophomore year. It's about the same as JSN. It's about the same as Jordan Addison. And he's probably going to go in the same round of the NFL draft. Now, I'm not going to be overreacting. Like I said, I think his play is more conducive to what you are going to have as an NFL player, not a fantasy football player. But going over to our next guy, Rashee Rice, don't really care about his NFL combine either. I mean, this is going to be a wide receiver that is a significant drop in tiers. I think after Hyatt, I mean, there were downs depending on how you rank those two guys. You're going to see that there's really not a consensus after that. I mean, Rashee Rice is a player that some people are projecting to go in the second round of the NFL draft. He is a very old wide receiver. He'll be 23 by the time this season starts. Went to SMU, but I will say he was a target hog. I mean, to be fair to him, the man had 157 targets this past season. Yeah. Let me repeat that again. He had 157 targets. I don't really care one way or another about his testing numbers, though. But main thing is what I'm going to be looking for the NFL Combine at the wide receiver position. I don't think it matters too much. I'm going to be trying to take advantage if other people overreact. We'll take advantage of their overreactions. And to go along with this, please, JSN, just have a respectable 40-yard dash time. Josh Downs, have a respectable 40-yard dash time. Don't be David Bell level slow. But thank you again. I appreciate you. Really hope you have a great day. Really hope we get to see you with the video tomorrow. And if you want to join our free fantasy football group chat, you can find the link in the comment section. Find it in the description. But thank you again. I appreciate you and hope you have a great day.